real conversations, and some hard truths. Gangs, drugs, and guns. Giving a voice to those willing to sacrifice. We have stories that need to be told. We have lessons that need to be taught. Protect and serve. Welcome to The Quiet Professional.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Nathan Romas with you. Today, we're going to be talking about a few things, but mostly pertaining to the war on drugs, opioid epidemic, and legalization from a law enforcement side of things. And for that, we got a person with some expertise, I would say at the very least. We got Jeffrey Stamm on the program. Jeff spent over 40 years in law enforcement. He started as a deputy sheriff in Sacramento, California, and finished as a special agent with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. With the DEA, Jeff worked both domestic and foreign assignments, and he's been to places such as San Jose, California, Brasilia, Brazil, Islamabad, Pakistan, and Kabul, Afghanistan. And he finished as a special agent in charge of the DEA's Global Aviation Division. Following his retirement, Jeff was appointed as the executive director of the Midwest High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area for the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, where he coordinated drug control efforts with local, state, and federal counterparts. Jeff obtained his master's in liberal arts at Southern Methodist University. He speaks Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese. He's lectured to various audiences at international conferences, training venues, community organizations, and universities. And lastly, he is the author of On Dope, a scholarly and impassioned argument for the need to maintain a strong drug law enforcement response across the U.S. He currently resides in Dallas, Texas with his wife, Jill, and continues to take part in speaking engagements, writing, and hot rodding, which maybe I'll ask you about that to start. So welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Nathan. Appreciate you having me, and it's my honor.
And I want to ask about this hot rodding, because that was kind of thrown in at the end of your bio when I was looking it up. What exactly do you do with that? You building cars, or you racing them, or?
Well, I kind of grew up working on cars and motorcycles. My toy right now is a 1970 Chevy Monte Carlo, and
Wow.
and I just tinker with that constantly. We also have a 1949 Studebaker pickup in the family that's got all Chevy running gears. So I'm not certainly good at the mechanics, the hands-on stuff, but I truly enjoy it. So
well, you're in the right place for it, because you definitely wouldn't want to be up here driving that around. You get about maybe 6 months out of the year, and we also put rocks on our road, so you'll get some nice chips in your windshield.
Well, especially buying cars out of Canada, they're always rusty thanks to the salt up in that climate too.
Yes, very true. I can't wait till we just have fully plastic cars. It's coming soon.
Exactly.
So just before we kind of started, I was saying we were going to start with talking about you. So I know that's not usually the thing you kind of been talking about, but maybe you could kind of take us back to the beginning. Tell us where little Jeff came from and how you got into this crazy world of the DEA.
Well, Nathan, once again, thanks for having me. I consider myself a child of privilege, and not the superficial kind that most people are used to talking about these days, relative to skin color. But I was extremely lucky to be born into a family that valued character development. My parents instituted or raised their kids with equal parts of love and discipline, taught us the value of hard work. And clearly, these kinds of lessons in life lead you to success throughout your career and your life. So once again, thanks to my mom and dad raising me right. I've got two brothers in Sacramento, California. Growing up at a time when California really was sort of the promise of the nation, where pretty much anything goes. However, back in the 60s and 70s when I grew up, the completely liberal atmosphere was tempered with a very widespread understanding that responsibility is sort of the other side of that same two-sided coin. I think in a lot of respects, California and America, to a lesser degree, has forgotten that lesson, that you need both liberty and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
My dad actually was a deputy sheriff in Sacramento County as well. So that's sort of how I got into law enforcement, I guess. It was kind of the family business. My two brothers didn't. But, I was really lucky to be raised in a household that where I had one of a boy's greatest role models in life living under the same roof. My dad was truly a great man, not because of so much where he ended up in life, but just his daily exemplary character that I learned so much from. I became a deputy sheriff there in Sacramento, but at the time he was a chief deputy, one of the high-ranking guys in the sheriff's department. And frankly, I got tired of being the chief's kid, so I looked for a way to sort of branch out on my own, look for different avenues. Right about the same time that I had a friend of mine who was in DEA, Sacramento, kind of recruited me. And I remember one of the quotes he told me early on was that being a DEA agent is actually the closest thing that exists to being James Bond in terms of the ability to work undercover, to work internationally, work with some of the greatest investigators and cops throughout the world. And you know what? After 31 years in DEA, I can tell you that he was absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
I had a wonderful career in DEA. My first office was San Jose, California. I came on in 1984, and that was just about the time that cocaine was really starting to explode, not just here in the U.S., but certainly in Canada as well. And I was a little disappointed that DEA didn't send me to Miami, Florida, back in the days of Miami Vice, and certainly that was the center of the universe. But they sent me instead to San Jose, California. And I have to say, in retrospect, it was probably the best place one could work at that time, because not only did we have Colombian cocaine, but we had Chinese white heroin, we had Persian heroin, Mexican black tar, and certainly we had methamphetamine controlled by outlaw motorcycle gangs, especially the Hells Angels.
And when you're saying the names like the Chinese white heroin stuff, is that just because of like the source of the country?
Well, it was really essentially the color. It was pure white heroin versus what was coming out of the Central Asian countries of Pakistan and Iran, which we called Persian brown. It was more of a tan heroin, less pure.
Okay.
And then certainly the Mexican variety back then was black tar. So they called it China white because it was pure white heroin coming out of China at that time.
Okay. One thing I do want to just go back to was you were working under your dad as the deputy sheriff. Did he have any thoughts on you going to the DEA?
Well, he had never worked narcotics himself, and I think he thought it was a good move going to the feds, if you will. I think he probably would have preferred me going to some other agency, like perhaps the FBI or Customs, that had a broader mission. I think a lot of people at the time, and maybe still do in law enforcement, that if you work DEA, you're going to get tired of just working one facet of law enforcement your entire career.
Yeah.
But I can tell you, as I alluded to earlier, the ability to work undercover, to work in the international arena, to promote, to work as I did. Ultimately, my final job in DEA was to supervise the entire global aviation piece for DEA. It's surprising how varied the job can be just working dope in an agency like DEA.
Wow. And what do your two brothers do if they're not in policing?
Well, one joined the Air Force. One became sort of the black sheep of the family and didn't get into anything in government, and runs a small pool business still in Sacramento, California. So there's three of us. I'm the middle, and in a lot of ways, we're all like stepping stones.
Yeah.
Once again, I've got a great lucky upbringing in my life with family that I had.
So you go off to DEA, friend recruits you, and then you go off to your first posting. Is that what they're called there? Posting?
Yes.
Yeah. And okay, so you're looking to go to Miami. That doesn't happen. So kind of go through what the start of this looks like then.
Well, you know what? My first 7 years in DEA was spent in San Jose, California. And at the time, the office there in San Jose consisted of about 5 agents and 5 San Jose PD cops. It was just a wonderful marriage. I've got nothing but respect for the innovative and imaginative law enforcement techniques that I learned from my local counterparts. But at the time, with cocaine still exploding on the scene, DEA at that time had something we called Operation Snowcap, which was sending agents on a temporary basis to South American production companies, namely the 3 Andean nations, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, to work with our foreign nation counterparts in those countries to try to stem the flow of cocaine and the production of cocaine at that time. So I signed up. I ended up going to Ecuador at the time, working with the Ecuadorian National Police. Wonderful, beautiful country. We found very few cocaine labs at that time. Of course, the ones we did find, we destroyed. But we did quite a bit to try to stem the flow of outbound cocaine as well as precursor chemicals at the time coming into the port of Guayaquil, moving their way into up the mountains in the Andes, as well as to Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. So,
are the police services down there, though, are they mostly, is it mostly dealing with the military, or are they national police? Like, how are they structured?
Well, they are national police, but they're very militaristic in their makeup and the way they operate. They're very top down. The normal regular line cops don't have very much authority.
Oh, okay.
It's very much kind of a militaristic kind of a setting where they're just doing what they're told to do.
Well, and you see like a lot on TV about, in movies, it's always like it's super corrupt and you never know who you can trust. When you're starting out, did that have any kind of influence on how you did your initial posting and the people you're involved with? Or was that even a thing back in the 80s? Like, was it the belief there that these are, very corrupt organizations?
Well, certainly corruption is a problem everywhere in the world. I think, to quote a former U.S. high-level attaché in Mexico who just recently retired, told me that corruption in Mexico today is worse than you can imagine.
Oh.
Mexico corruption is just horrific. But in my experience in South America, at least at that time, I didn't really see it. Now, certainly it probably existed, especially at the high-level political ranks. But working with law enforcement at that time, we had very specific missions, very specific information that we were able to act on and monitor. So we didn't really see much blowback relative to our information getting coughed up to the bad guys.
Okay. Well, how do you, so when you're there and you're talking about stemming the flow of this stuff coming north, what is that, or what does that look like?
Well, certainly interdiction activities, everything from roadblocks. And once again, U.S. DEA agents were not down there doing those things unilaterally. We were working with our host nation counterparts because we didn't have any inherent law enforcement authority in their country. Doing roadblocks, patrolling rivers to control the movement of precursor chemicals upriver or cocaine downriver kind of thing. Looking at the flow of precursor chemicals that at the time we had a very significant operation called ChemCon, where we a lot of the precursor chemicals at that time were coming out of the U.S. So we were working with U.S. chemical companies to place satellite trackers in many of these chemical shipments that found their way to drug labs, enabling us to pinpoint where they were and then conduct raids.
Okay.
In fact, I still remember one particular complex of drug labs raided in a place called Tranquilandia, Colombia at the time. I certainly wasn't there at the time, but it was simply staggering to us the level of production and sophistication that was going on by the Colombian cartels at that time in making cocaine in the middle of the jungle.
Really?
So certainly was a wake-up call to America at that time. And And certainly we've made a big dent in cocaine flows over that time, but unfortunately, we're seeing the growth of cocaine come back thanks to liberal policies and governments that are trying to appease drug trafficking groups in all over Latin America, actually. And cocaine production today, a lot of people don't realize, is about twice as much as it was in the peak days of 1993, when that was the peak crack cocaine epidemic in our country. And coincidentally, was also the peak homicide year in the United States up until now.
So the link between the drugs and the crime, that's the nexus.
Exactly. And we can get into that in a little bit more detail later when we talk about the drug cartels. But clearly that link exists. But right now there's about 2,000 metric tons of cocaine being produced in the three Andean countries, principally Colombia, but also to a lesser extent, Peru and Bolivia. And that's according to the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. And once again, that's about twice as much as was being produced in all three Andean countries in the early 90s. So we've gone backwards. Much of that cocaine now is not completely destined for North American markets like U.S. and Canada, given the expansion of the cocaine trade in not just Western Europe, but Asia.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true that the vast profits to be made from drug trafficking are actually not in producing the drugs, it's moving them to market. So using cocaine as an example, you can acquire a kilo of coke right now in, say, Cartagena, Colombia for $2,500. Move that same kilo to North America and increase your profit tenfold. You move that kilo to Western Europe, 20-fold. And if you have the guts and the connections right now to sell a kilo of coke in communist China, that can earn you as much as $250,000 today.
Wow.
That's why they're engaged in drug trafficking. The profits are simply staggering.
Wow. And back at that time, so when you're at this first placement, were any of these other countries kind of coming into play even then? Or is it mostly you're kind of fixated on South America? Like they were the main people at this time and outside influence not really a big part of it?
Well, no, I think at the time the nation's focus was on cocaine because it was exploding in use, and it was seen to be acceptable by a lot of facets of our society at the time. But we still had problems with marijuana and Mexican black tar and China white heroin. We still had all of these other issues going on, especially in my office at that time in California, with the Hells Angels produced methamphetamine, clandestine labs producing meth all across the country. And pretty amazing to me how the Mexicans have completely supplanted outlaw motorcycle gangs in this country relative to meth production. I know Canada's still got a significant Hells Angels issue, but we had national drug threats from various parts of the world. But our focus at that time, from the White House at least, was principally cocaine. In 1991, I had the opportunity to put in for a foreign assignment, and I was selected for Brazil. Once again, initially, I was a little bit disappointed because the center of the universe at that time was Colombia, but they sent me to Brazil instead. Learned to speak Portuguese instead of Spanish, which I thought was going to be a lot less useful. But once again, I found myself in the center of history relative to cocaine flows coming out of the Andean nations through Brazil, not just supplying North American markets, but increasingly at that time in the early 90s, we started seeing a lot more Colombian cartel exports through Brazil to Western Europe. So I got to work a wide variety of organizations and cases with my Brazilian federal counterparts. It's interesting at the time that the Brazilians at that time really looked at the entire drug problem as America's problem, and they certainly were helpful and great partners in drug investigations, but they never really thought that it would be their problem. Fast forward to today, most people don't realize that the largest cocaine market in South America is in Brazil.
Is that just because maybe the drugs weren't staying in Brazil? Like maybe there weren't a lot of end users there. It was mostly getting shipped out, or was it already a problem there?
Well, drug policy experts will tell you there's a problem called leakage, whenever you've got drug flows, there's always going to be leakage of certain amounts of drugs that stay in the transshipment countries and eventually becomes their problem. That's certainly the case of Brazil. As drug flows increase through Brazil, more and more drug trafficking groups locally in Brazil desired payment in product as opposed to money, so they could maximize their profits by selling to their own citizens. And then fast forward to today, cocaine, even the old-fashioned version of crack, which used to be our scourge in this country and still is in certain parts, became a true scourge in Brazil, especially in their favelas or their shanty towns in Rio and Sao Paulo. Brazil's got a horrific crime rate, horrific homicide rate in many of their large cities. Certainly nothing close to what they have in Mexico today. In fact, most people don't realize that the most dangerous city in the world right now is Tijuana, Mexico. And 5 of the 6 most dangerous cities in the world are in northern Mexico.
Wow.
Thanks to the drug flows and organized crime. But
wow. So where you're in Brazil, for whatever reason, they keep placing you kind of on the outskirts of Colombia. They'll never actually put you in Colombia. Where do you kind of go from Brazil then? Because you've got quite a few places you've worked.
Well, coming out of Brazil, I ended up getting promoted to a sort of first level supervisor in a little town called Brownsville, Texas, which was right on the Mexican border. Actually, wonderful opportunity, because coming out of Brazil, we started seeing the transition from the Colombian cartels owning distribution inside the U.S. to, because of extradition to the U.S., which a lot of the Colombian cartels feared greatly, started just selling outright cocaine loads to their Mexican counterparts, and then essentially farmed out retail level distribution inside the United States to the Mexicans. So Brownsville at the time, once again, I probably would have preferred another more exciting, bigger city, but I found myself once again in the middle of history. Brownsville was a wonderful place to work. Drug flows coming out of Mexico. Certainly we had issues with illegal immigration at the time, not what we're seeing today, but was a problem back then too. But we started seeing not just burgeoning levels of marijuana coming out of Mexico, but increasing amounts of cocaine and black tar heroin.
Wow. Well, and when you start to see that changeover from all the cannabis stuff, the marijuana, into these other drugs, what was kind of the reason at the time for that? Is it just dollars and cents? Is it easier to package? Like, I mean, a kilo of coke is a lot smaller than a kilo of marijuana. So what was kind of the main drivers for why they were switching over?
Well, they weren't really switching over. Marijuana trafficking never really diminished at the same time cocaine was exploding. They realized that they could make money distributing both. In fact, much of the marijuana distribution avenues and organizations inside the U.S. and increasingly Canada as well was primed to start handling cocaine as well. Now, black tar heroin was a little bit different. That was more of mom and pop operations from small villages in Mexico that moved black tar heroin. But Mexican marijuana never diminished up until recent legalization in many of our states in the U.S. And we can talk about marijuana in great detail later. But really, the main reason was that the Colombians essentially gave up wholesale and retail distribution inside the U.S. to the Mexicans. So they increased in size and strength, in their predatory nature inside the U.S. With not just marijuana, but with cocaine as well. And then certainly, as we're seeing today, ultimately they expanded into methamphetamine and then fentanyl, and the whole thing's out of control.
While you're kind of coming up through your career and to this point, Was there a lot of interaction with Canadian agencies that you came across?
You know what? When I first went to Brazil in the early 90s, the RCMP actually had a Canadian
Hmm.
legal attaché assigned to your embassy there in Brasilia. Great guy, did a lot of joint cases together. Ultimately, I think budget cuts in Canada resulting in them no longer stationing someone in Brazil. But yeah, I worked with RCMP and Canadian authorities and in various agencies throughout my career in many different countries, even in Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Well, and you had one kind of highlight that you had sent me from your career where it was about 94 and you were working on some surveillance of the Hells Angels. Can you talk about that? Because there was a connection to Rio in there.
Well, you know what? In 1994, the RCMP had already pulled out your liaison. And I'm sitting in the office one day in the U.S. Embassy in Brasilia, and I get a phone call out of the blue from the outlaw motorcycle gang intelligence unit from the RCMP in Ottawa. Said, hey, listen, we just found out that the entire leadership of the Hells Angels from Canada are going to have a meeting and a strategy session, if you will, with the Brazilian Hells Angels counterparts in Rio de Janeiro. And because of budget cuts or management decisions, I don't know what, he said that the RCMP couldn't send anybody to cover that. So could you guys in DEA? And I said, gee, Copacabana, Rio de Janeiro, we're on it. So I actually spent about a week doing surveillance on the Hells Angels, identifying all the folks that were there. We didn't do anything real sophisticated like conduct wire intercepts or any of that, but just certainly identified all of the Canadian Hells Angels, their American counterparts that were there, as well as the blossoming Hells Angels chapters in Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and Manaus at that time. One particular day, I was out on the beach doing surveillance, looking like a tourist at a sidewalk stand, drinking a beverage, taking surveillance photos, and at the time, the sort of traditional or fashionable swimsuit for ladies was known as a fio dental floss bikini. As you can imagine, it was a horrific assignment. It was terrible. It was difficult, but somebody had to do it.
Well, I was going to say on the other end of things, the budget cuts. This sounds pretty standard up here. I hear that quite a bit. So, well, lucky for you.
It's with everybody.
One thing too, just kind of, and you mentioned a bit earlier with the bikers. So I know a lot of people attribute, I want to say, a lot of crime to them, and the power of the patch, and it's got a lot of, it brings with it like a lot of fear and intimidation when people are wearing that. But what I'm wondering is, like they're spread worldwide, they're known very well, but how come they're allowed to spread, or do you know of a reason why they're allowed to spread when you have people like cartels, like triads? You got these organizations that, as far as I understand, are much bigger, more well-funded. Like they're basically small governments. They have a GDP with how much money they bring in. So where do the Hells Angels kind of fall in the whole scheme of things? Are they kind of like a middle tier group? They're used by these bigger ones. I just find it interesting they're allowed to spread everywhere where you have very established cartels already.
Well, I don't think as far as a drug trafficking threat, the Hells Angels are anywhere near even the middle tier, at least in the United States. I think we've decimated the Hells Angels to the point where they're really nothing but low-level, retail-level distributors. Why they're allowed to flourish? I think the Hells Angels over time have learned not to proclaim themselves to anyone that they're criminal organizations. They're social organizations who ride motorcycles, kind of thing. That's their shtick. But certainly, as I said, the Hells Angels have been decimated thanks to relentless law enforcement case building against them here in the U.S. I think to a a much larger degree in Canada and certainly some of the Western European countries. They've continued to be allowed to flourish at the retail level, drug distribution.
Mhm.
But for the longest time in America and Canada, the Hells Angels and other outlaw motorcycle gangs controlled meth production and distribution. In about 2005, thanks to the Combat Methamphetamine Act in the U.S. that Congress passed, where we really effectively constricted precursor chemical flows, namely pseudoephedrine, to distribution in the U.S., meth production shifted into Mexico. And now what you have is wholesale level production distribution is controlled entirely by Mexican drug cartels. And Hells Angels are just like any other gang inside the U.S., buying from them to conduct retail level sales. So
Okay.
they're still a threat. They certainly still engage in gambling, prostitution, organized violence of every kind. They certainly deserve to continue to be watched as an organized crime organization. But in terms of global drug trafficking and the amount of volume and threat that they pose to North America, they're a shell of what they used to be.
Yeah. Well, so kind of going back to your career here, you were in Brownsville. Can you take us a bit more through where you go from there?
From there, I get transferred to Washington, D.C., where I was assigned to first our South America section as what we call a staff coordinator. Shortly thereafter, I ended up getting promoted to be the deputy chief of all of international operations for DEA. Wonderful position, enabled me to see drug trafficking from a global perspective, not just the different threats that the rest of the globe presented to the U.S., but certainly the individual countries that had their own challenges relative to organized crime, drug threats, both in production, transshipment, and consumption.
Well, and that kind of leads to maybe one question I was going to ask. I think it's a good spot to ask is there anyone else in the world, in any of these other countries, that has someone that does the work the DEA does that's very similar? Or is the DEA very unique from your perspective?
No, there's a number of countries out there that have their own DEA. In fact, Chile in South America named their total drug organization police DEA after us years ago. But depending on the political makeup of the country, how they view drugs as a separate threat to form their own anti-drug police. But certainly throughout South America, especially in the Andean countries, Mexico even, they've formed their own totally specific counter-drug police. And for a reason, it's necessary. Drug trafficking is a very specific subset of law enforcement in general, requiring some very specific kinds of information, not just in criminal investigative objectives, but chemistry and money laundering, all of the ancillary issues that drug trafficking produces.
So when you're in charge of the whole thing and you got kind of the big picture going on, is that what year would that have been?
That was in 2000, 1999 to 2001.
Okay.
Right before I ended up going to, had a bright idea of moving my entire family to Pakistan in 2001.
So that was one of the points I was going to ask about, because I thought, especially given 9/11 and the timing of moving to Pakistan, I kind of want to spend a few minutes on that and see, what that experience was like, and if you could kind of tell us what's going on in the world and your involvement with stuff in Pakistan.
Well, Pakistan at the time was one of the three heroin source regions of the world, Southwest Asian heroin, principally coming out of Pakistan and Afghanistan. I took a promotion going to Pakistan, Islamabad, as sort of the regional supervisor for Central Asia and parts of the Middle East, trying to stem some of the flow of Southwest Asian heroin coming out of that part of the world into the U.S. As you can imagine, 9/11 didn't just change the world; it completely refocused mine.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the time, the only U.S. government agency that had any human intelligence inside Afghanistan next door, and by the way, we're talking about the Taliban government that owned that country at that time, was DEA. So we were uniquely poised to actually provide some truly outsized intelligence on what was going on inside Afghanistan relative to the warlords and the narco terrorists making money from the heroin trade and certainly forwarding their terrorist objectives along with Al Qaeda at the time. In fact, in December of 2001, when war broke out, I was actually asked to be among the first group of civilians to fly into Kabul and reestablish our U.S. embassy there in the capital city. An embassy, by the way, that had been closed since the 1979 Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan. How's that for the arc of history? So
that must have been a pretty rundown building. You have to revamp it.
Well, it was not just run down; it was completely abandoned. It bombed out. The windows were shot out. And I tell the story occasionally that for over 20 years, birds had been nesting in the ceiling, the rafters of the old embassy building there, depositing their mess all over the floor. And that was the floor, along with all of my new best friends from the U.S. Marine Corps, slept on every night. And the Marines and I, we made a kind of an important discovery. We discovered what that white stuff in bird poop is. And I always ask the question, do you know what that is? And the answer is, turns out that's bird shit too. And I tell that story just to illustrate the point that sometimes things are exactly as they seem relative to black and white, right and wrong, good and evil. And certainly that's the case with drug trafficking and abuse. But
well, when you land and you're in Pakistan, like, is it the most secure area that you can be in? Like, is it pretty safe, relatively speaking? Or are you going into these places thinking like, I might have to pick up a rifle at some point and kind of get to business here?
Well, we were armed at the time. When 9/11 broke out, our families were evacuated. And certainly it turned out to sort of be a disaster personally, family-wise, but professionally, I was in the middle of history at the time. So was it dangerous? Potentially, yes. We actually had a few months after 9/11 happened, a suicide bomber walk into the Protestant International Church in Islamabad, mostly foreigners, blew himself up with a suicide bomb, killed a number of Americans, and I'm certain other foreign dignitaries as well. So yeah, could it be dangerous? Sure. Pakistan DEA presence today is not what it used to be. It's still quite dangerous, but at the time, we were trying to control information inside Afghanistan next door and feed it to the intelligence community, U.S. military, and a lot of military ops against warlords. And by the way, the warlords over there are essentially the drug traffickers, the Taliban. They're all wrapped up into one. Made some pretty significant gains relative to the rule of law in Afghanistan at the time.
Wow. So how long did you spend in that area of the world?
It turned out to be about a year and a half before I finally came out. Went back to headquarters for a short time, and then I ended up coming to Dallas, Texas, where once again, sort of the middle of history, as we started to see the blossoming of the Zetas drug cartel, which really is the first iteration of narco-terrorism, in my opinion, coming out of Mexico, dominate the cocaine trade, meth, marijuana, heroin, you name it, coming into the Texas region and increasingly the rest of the country. So spent a number of years as a sort of a mid-level supervisor in Dallas, Texas, working with some great local and state investigators in this state. In 2011, I got promoted to the head of our global aviation division, also based here in the Dallas, Texas area, which essentially is responsible for aerial surveillance mostly, as well as extraditions of international defendants, movement of equipment and personnel throughout the country and the world. Wonderful job, great professionals that, and probably not well known, but the pilots that work for DEA are not just pilots; they're also special agents. Because as we used to say, there's nobody that's going to take better care of a surveillance operation of the undercover agents on the ground than a fellow special agent up in the air.
So is the DEA sending people to like flight school, or you just kind of recruit out of the Air Force?
A little of both. Yeah, we actually do some training of our own folks in a variety of different aircraft platforms.
Okay.
But most of the pilots actually have a former military background, which certainly reduces the level of training needed to bring somebody up to speed.
Yeah. So where do you go
and
from
certainly,
there? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I actually, from there, I retired at the end of 2015, and I was selected for the head of the Midwest HIDA, the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program, which is essentially it's a law enforcement grant program under the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP. That's essentially our drug czar's office in Washington, which has been a cabinet level agency for many years. So had drug control task forces that we supported throughout 7 states across the Midwest. Had a great relationship with law enforcement at every level throughout the Midwest, doing some great cases. And as I used to say, cases in the Midwest, I'm sure just like a place like Edmonton, Canada, don't always have the largest seizures. They don't always have the sexiest of cases. But you know what? In terms of responsiveness to the drug threat, innovation, imagination of our criminal investigators in the Midwest, I don't think anybody did it better.
One question I wanted to ask on that was just on the breakdown geographically of the U.S. So you often hear Midwest is one of the terms used. Is the U.S. kind of broken down maybe when it comes to drug trafficking into like a East and West Coast, and then you have Midwest? Is there something unique about that, or is this just like general terminology?
I think general terminology, and certainly every agency's got different divisions or offices, what they consider Midwest or West or East or Northeast. But for ONDCP, the Midwest really was more of a political formation of sort of concentrating grant programs to certain geographic regions. So,
okay, I was thinking like maybe if there was some sort of a very different economic situation, Midwest, maybe generally poorer. It's like mostly farming communities, but then you get to the coast and it's like there's tons of money out there and all the big schools. So they have even different types of drugs between what you might see on the coast. Then you go to the Midwest, maybe it's more the hard stuff, the dirtier drugs.
You know what? I don't think the Midwest has any special significance in terms of the drug threat compared to anybody else. Certainly, there are different microclimates or different mini drug threats pursuant to the area. But Chicago, for instance, probably the third or fourth largest city in the U.S., is considered in the Midwest. One of the biggest early fentanyl cases to come out of the U.S. was conducted in Fargo, North Dakota.
Oh, really?
Against what was initially sort of an internet fentanyl distribution ring in that part of the country. That, thanks to aggressive law enforcement and prosecution by the North Dakota state authorities and with some assistance from DEA and HSI, sort of kept working the case further and further upstream. And it was actually Fargo, North Dakota that did the first indictment of a Chinese fentanyl lab operator in the country.
Wow.
Now, we'll probably never see him. I don't think China's ever going to cough him up relative to our extradition request. But once again, a tremendous international drug case worked in the Midwest. And there's a lot of folks that use the term border city. I don't think there's such a thing anymore. Fargo became a border city at that time. We've got major cartel emissaries working in St. Louis or probably even Edmonton, Canada, that aren't 3, 4, or 5 rungs below cartel leadership. They're 1 or 2 removed from cartel leadership back in Culiacan, Sinaloa, or Michoacan, or Monterrey, Mexico, with the Gulf Cartel. It's Homeland Security had recently said that, at least in the U.S., the various Mexican cartels have a presence in over 3,000 American cities and towns.
Wow.
They're here solely to sell dope to Americans and Canadians, in your case.
Yeah.
Now, I can think of no greater modern example of Cicero's warning to his fellow Romans about allowing an enemy within the gates than that.
Well, I know for a fact, like you're 100% correct. We have cartel dope that makes its way up here. We have stuff that comes from China. We have stuff from the Middle East. So everybody's involved, and it's a very globalized world. Like there are no more borders, essentially, when it comes to this stuff.
I've always said there is no more globalized industry than the dope trade.
Yeah.
And that's continuing to increase as the world gets smaller, if you will, especially in terms of the rise in synthetics. It's no longer necessary to grow large plots of drugs like opium in a country and convert it to heroin. You can make fentanyl essentially anywhere. You can make meth anywhere. And that's why we're starting to or continuing to see the rise of synthetics throughout the world.
Well, maybe that brings me to one of the topics we were going to get onto was the war on drugs. So I've heard this term or this idea throughout my whole life. Can you kind of give me your thoughts on it after all these years, and maybe some of the media narratives on it, or some of the critics, what you've heard from them and your thoughts on their opinions?
It would be my pleasure. I think there's no more misunderstood and vilified term out there than the war on drugs. The term does, in fact, come from Richard Nixon in 1971 when he declared his war on drugs. But it was not meant to be a literal war. It was designed to be a metaphorical call to arms, the moral equivalent of war. In exactly, by the way, the same way that his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, had done with his war on poverty, or Jimmy Carter had subsequently done with his war on cancer. And by the way, have we won those 2 other wars yet?
No.
But it's completely either forgotten or not known today that in 1971, President Nixon used as his principal weapon in his war on drugs, drug treatment. The president increased funding for treatment and prevention programs 8-fold within 2 years, consuming 2/3 of the entire drug control budget and dwarfing the monies allocated to the supply side or enforcement programs across the federal government. But President Nixon and the nation would actually come to learn the limitations of government's ability to affect behavior solely through compassionate or therapeutic means. Because we came to find out that without the ability to compel drug addicts into long-term treatment, initial drug treatment failed 90 to 95% of the time. By the way, you fast forward to today, initial drug treatment fails 90 to 95% of the time. That's why it's called a chronic relapsing condition. Boston University did a study here a while back that showed that the mean number of drug treatment episodes was 6.9 times over a 6.5-year period before it finally takes effect. And that doesn't even include the number of addicts who died along the way. So too, drug prevention programs, after long-term study, we realized that unless we simultaneously reduce drug availability on our streets, drug supply, most drug prevention programs turn out to be wholly ineffective. What did make a difference in Nixon's day was targeting the Corsican Italian mafia supplying the vast majority of heroin to Americans at that time, known as the French Connection. It was law enforcement that staunched this nation's first opioid epidemic. And it would be law enforcement that would do it again and again against future drug threats, future transnational criminal organizations. And I always make this point to my law enforcement audiences that given the limitations, the known limitations of drug treatment and prevention programs, law enforcement strategically may in fact be the most effective and the most compassionate drug treatment and prevention program available to us today.
Well, you even see that with frontline officers. I think there's a narrative out there that they are, I don't know, just like grabbing people off the street and throwing them in a cell and leaving them there. When in fact, we do like patrol officers stuff. They do a lot of transports for people. They take them to the hospital. They take them to the drug treatment places, to the shelters where they can get that help. So I think a lot of the view of law enforcement has been skewed, whether that's by media or politicians.
I totally agree. I think it's been skewed purposefully by the left wing, by liberals who want to talk about the drug war as entirely the enforcement apparatus, when in fact we know that it also includes treatment and prevention programs, the so-called three pillars of the three-legged stool. But we're made to believe that our prisons and our jails are filled with mere drug users.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that mass incarceration has been spawned by the drug war. These aren't just misguided notions; they're dangerous lies. And here's a stat that Americans need to understand: on any given day in our country, there are roughly 1.4 million people behind bars in our various state prisons throughout the country. And of that total, according to the U.S. Department of Justice in 2019, less than 15% are there for drug offenses. But that's really not the important statistic there. The other side of that's what's important. 85% of our state inmates are there for rape, robbery, murder, grand larceny, aggravated assault. Our prisons are not filled with mere drug users.
Mm-hmm.
They're not even filled with drug traffickers. They're filled with violent criminals and serial thieves. And they are exactly where they need to be if we care anything at all about the protection of our society.
Well, and you know what? You bring up a good point there too. One of the things that I've never quite understood is when you hear that like drug trafficking or just drug offenses in general are a non-violent crime. But, and again, maybe this will speak to kind of the nexus of the drugs and crimes. But one of the quotes that you had in a paper I was reading, and it was talking about how drug trafficking is inherently violent and one of the most murderous crimes in the U.S. I would say that's probably the same here, but we don't really keep that many statistics. But drug trafficking itself, it invites that type of crime. And the violence, you need violence to protect your supply, to protect your logistics, to even right down to the dealers out there doing the dial-a-dope. They carry bear spray and knives, if not guns on them now. So, the drug trafficking brings the violence with it.
Well, that's true to a certain degree, but there's actually three levels of three types of crime that we associate with illegal drugs. The first is the psychopharmacological, which causes people to do stupid or illegal activities simply because they're on drugs. And clearly alcohol falls into that category as well. The second is the economic model, which argues that people commit crime to be able to buy dope or to lead some drug-infused lifestyle absent the responsibilities of normal citizenship. And the third is the systemic model, which argues that given their illegality, there's an inherent level of violent criminal activity that accompanies illegal drug trafficking and use. It is that third model that is constantly cited by the left as the entirety of the drug problem, when in fact, the bigger piece of that are the first two, the psychopharmacological and the economic. Clearly we've got bigger issues than just the fact that drugs are illegal. Actually, the pharmaceutical explosion of prescription pain pills in our country explodes the myth that it's been the illegality of drugs or the war on drugs that's been the problem. Mm-hmm. Prescription pain pills pushed out by the ton by the American pharmaceutical industry beginning at about 1996. Not only has killed over 500,000 Americans since 1999 directly, not indirectly causing them to transition to heroin or fentanyl, but directly. they're completely legal, taxed, regulated, yet still highly abused. The prescription pain pill phenomenon proves the point that every drug epidemic is actually about two things: drug availability and drug acceptability.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the point that I think most citizens have to understand. That the drug violence in this country is not just driven by their illegality. In fact, that quote that you just mentioned comes from the former drug czar of the U.S., who said that, especially right now, we've got 110,000 Americans dying of drug overdoses every year and continuing to rise. That's over 300 every single day.
Yeah.
So he was right when he said that drug trafficking is actually the most murderous criminal activity in the history of America.
Well, and kind of on that point, you're saying there's the availability and the acceptability. One of the things I was going to ask was on the acceptability part, because I think, and you even talk about this in one of the addresses you did, where basically we want to look to stigmatize the decision to use drugs, but not the receiving of treatment. So can you talk a little bit about that and maybe how you might do that? Because you kind of compared it to the tobacco industry.
Well, I think we're made to believe that we cannot stigmatize those who are addicted to drugs and need our help. I don't believe anyone, public or private, actually targets for abuse those who willingly step forward seeking help for their demons.
Mm-hmm.
But since we know that the vast majority of in fact, nearly all drug addiction starts as recreational drug taking, I think as a culture, as a society, that's exactly what we need to stigmatize.
Mm-hmm.
At least every bit as much as we've done with tobacco. We have to stigmatize the 15-year-old boy who thinks he's cool smoking weed after school with his buddies. The college girl who thinks she's sophisticated ordering fentanyl pills from the dark web or Snapchat and then paying for it with some virtual currency like Zcash or Bitcoin. And most of all, in my opinion, I think we need to stigmatize those social, political, and media influences that normalize and glamorize drug use. One of the most dangerous industries, and maybe I shouldn't lump them all together, but the entertainment industry today is horrible at glamorizing drug use.
Yeah.
And worst of all is the music industry.
Yeah.
On any given day right now, the average American adolescent listens to about 2.4 hours of music every single day. And according to one study, during that period of time, he or she hears 84 explicit references to substance use, either neutral or pro. And over the course of a year, in their private iPod worlds or through their earbuds, that's about 10,000 references that constantly pound into their head. And we think we're going to push back on that with one or two red ribbon campaigns or events in our schools every year. We're simply being outgunned by our own culture every day.
Well, 100%. And the pop culture is what's in the kids' faces all day. It's what they see. That's what they hear. Those people, I guess, as the kids kind of grow up and move into their teens, the parents are less involved. The kids don't want to be around their parents as much. Who's getting more of that face time with these young forming minds, right? And one of the things that I thought you brought up here too on the availability side, that was a really good point, was that the availability is the one factor that the government probably has the most control over. So instead of focusing so much on the stigma and, like you're saying, a lot of these different types of campaigns, the government should maybe be focused a little more on the availability. So again, that's the law enforcement having certain laws that allow you to maybe stem things before they even enter the country. So can you talk a little bit about that pillar and your thoughts around the availability?
Well, let me say what I alluded to earlier about the three pillars of the three-legged stool. We absolutely need treatment and prevention, but there are a whole number and facets of society engaged in the treatment and prevention realms. But there's only one entity that can affect drug availability, and that's law enforcement and government. So clearly, they've got ownership of that complete piece. Now, we currently spend about half of our total drug control budget, roughly about $40 billion a year, just for drug treatment. And that also includes private sectors and personal insurance, out-of-pocket expenses for people seeking drug treatment. All that's necessary, but we cannot solve this problem with just continuing to try to treat the downstream repercussions of drug use and trafficking, i.e., drug treatment.
Mm-hmm.
As I just said earlier, a lot of our drug addicts today, especially in the fentanyl crisis, will end up dying before drug treatment actually takes effect. It's not as compassionate as people think it is. We absolutely have to do more to make drugs less available. And reducing drug supply on our streets is the one thing that can really allow drug treatment and prevention to gain traction in our communities.
Yeah.
So, you know what? Once again, a lot of people think the war on drugs is engaged against their own citizens. It's filling our jails and prisons with mere drug users. Nothing could be further than the truth. Society at some point has to draw a line with what we don't find acceptable relative to making drugs available to young children,
Mm-hmm.
to anybody and everybody who wants to buy them in any amount. There always has to be some levels of controls, as we see even with legal drugs. Legalization is not the answer.
Well, and that brings me right to the next thing I was going to ask about. And I guess maybe the third pillar is leadership. And maybe we can kind of segue that also into the legalization debate. So one of the things that I always found interesting was the leaders, the politicians, the decision makers always kind of vilifying this war on drugs. But now we're kind of moving to a space where we're legalizing things. And I don't know if this is occurring in the US, but up here in Canada, in Vancouver, they are, people are allowed to possess now 2.5 grams of like meth, heroin, cannabis. Like they've kind of just put everything in together and said, as long as you have this amount or less, police can't seize it. They won't charge you. You can't be arrested. What are your thoughts on this whole, I'll say, maybe we'll start with the leadership aspect, where they might have gone wrong. And then we're kind of coming down to this legalization idea. So can you kind of talk about that aspect?
Well, I think everywhere it's been tried. In the Netherlands is one example. Portugal is another, where they have legalized or at least decriminalized supposed personal use amounts of drugs. They constantly talk about the successes of the heroin program over there, where they provide heroin to addicts, but heroin is not their big issue over there in Europe anymore. It's cocaine, and methamphetamine is growing fast. So thanks to the legalization environment in places like Western Europe, a lot of people don't realize the Mexican cartels today are actually manufacturing methamphetamine in Western Europe. 32 meth labs were discovered in the Netherlands in 2020, each one of them owned and operated by a Mexican cartel. So relative to sort of the laissez-faire attitude of drugs in the Netherlands, I think the Dutch have started to wake up and realize that their lax policies have actually encouraged organized crime to move into their country. And what used to be a beautiful city, Amsterdam, has been described by one recent observer as the most violent and squalid city in Europe.
Really?
Drugs brought that on. So once again, the options relative to drugs are not between throwing drug users in jail. We don't do that. I don't know of any country in the world that does that just because they're drug users that need help, or complete legalization. There are a myriad number of steps in between that can happen. You may want to talk about marijuana separately, but what we're finding in California is that marijuana legalization has ushered in a new Wild West. It has not made California safer, better,
Mm-hmm.
more free. We've got 90% of the marijuana grows in California today are actually owned by organized crime, where they come in and set up what we call trespass grows in national forests, state parks, private property, fouling the environment in every way. 90% of all the marijuana coming out of California today is grown by organized crime in trespass grows, but to the point where we have commercial legal entities leaving the state in droves simply because they can't compete with the black market.
Yeah.
A black market, by the way, that's also involved in cocaine, meth, heroin, fentanyl, you name it. So for anyone paying attention to look at drug legalization as the answer, once again, just trying to diminish that systemic problem of drugs and crime ignores the other two problems that come with expanded drug use.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? I think, at least when you see things in the media, I want to say a lot of the narrative gets kind of lost in just this giant sea of people saying all kinds of things. But they talk about it like legalization is like the end all be all, the one solution, where you don't see much writing on saying, hey, we need a whole host of things. We need a law enforcement aspect. We need treatment aspect. Like we need to do all of these things. But usually, whatever article I've managed to ever find, it always just talks about like one thing, like that's the solution. So I think that's kind of dangerous. It's repeating a lot of the mistakes of the past. Like you're saying, going back to Nixon, you have seen a lot of these things have been tried already, and now we're kind of going back to them saying, "Hey, let's try this." It's like, well, we have a whole bunch of history to refer to. Like, why is nobody talking about this?
Well, most of the arguments from the left really are set up against straw man arguments that is not true. It's not the case anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Law enforcement's been saying for decades now that we're not going to be able to arrest or police our way out of the drug issue. That's absolutely true. But we're also not going to be able to treat or prevent our way out either. All three legs of that three-legged stool are necessary.
Yeah.
And as I always say, all of us run the risk of falling into Maslow's trap, where he warned that if a hammer is your preferred tool, then every problem looks like a nail.
Mm-hmm.
So the humility that our drug law enforcers have had to accept concerning their complete inability to eradicate the problem alone must also be accepted by those engaged in the treatment and prevention realms.
Yes.
Whether drugs are legal, as in the case of prescription pain pills, or illegal, which we've talked about a host of them already, it's absolutely true, according to several studies, that drugs drive upwards as much as 2/3 of all of our crime in society.
Mm-hmm.
2/3. And what's more, 40% of those who get arrested for drug trafficking are also arrested with a weapon. 40% of our homicides in this country are connected to the drug trade somehow. So much of that is not due to that systemic problem. It's due to the fact that people just want to lead a drug-induced lifestyle and have complete unimpeded liberty. And one more article about point about legalization. It's been estimated that 80% of our homeless people across the country today, and I know Canada's got an issue with that as well,
Mm-hmm.
Are addicted to opioids. The other 20% probably to meth, coke, weed, alcohol, marijuana, or some combination thereof. In Los Angeles County alone, we now have 65,000 homeless people clustered in squalid and filthy tent cities, ushering in diseases not seen since medieval times: typhus, leprosy,
Wow.
bubonic plague, not to mention skyrocketing rates of crime for miles surrounding these places. It's been said that the average heavy opioid user consumes more than $1,800 a month buying his drugs. So using this as our baseline, we can predict out that the various Mexican cartels earn as much as $2 billion a year just supplying fentanyl
Mm-hmm.
to the various homeless populations up and down the West Coast, from San Diego to Vancouver. Now, it's been said that a lot of our city leaders in these places are paralyzed with indecision on what to do. No, in my opinion, they're paralyzed with their own tolerance. The only answer thus far has just been to pass out more and more naloxone, more and more government programs. In fact, the former governor of Maine, Paul LePage, in my opinion, was absolutely right when he said that naloxone doesn't really save lives. It merely extends them until the next overdose. And I think in some of these homeless camps where we have de facto legalized drug use, that's truly the case.
So there's two things I want to get to before the end of our time. One was just talking a bit more about the cartels, and then also some of the areas for addressing drugs. Can you just talk a bit about the cartels and the state of them today, kind of their integration with all these outside people? So we see they are connected to China. There's a lot of cooperation between all these very big organizations. Sometimes I know just from my own experience, there can be issues among law enforcement trying to cooperate and share information. So do you see like a growing trend of the bad guys getting along, pooling resources, starting to work together to kind of get into countries? And where's the cartel in all this?
Short answer to that is yes. Now, given some of my background, especially in Pakistan and Afghanistan, I don't pretend to be an expert on terrorism per se, but I do have a little experience where drugs and terrorism have intersected. I think one of the growing threats that we face, especially the Mexican variety, is that blend of drug trafficking and international terrorism we now call narco-terrorism. And let me first just say, if you take a look at the methods and the tactics of both terrorist groups and drug traffickers, they're remarkably similar. The only difference really is just a matter of degree. Terrorists look to overthrow the entire existing political order and replace it with some form of communism or socialism or perhaps an Islamic caliphate. Drug traffickers, not so much. They only look to degrade and erode those government forces that oppose them, usually the police, so they can continue to use the weakened husk of the nation state to make money from the backs of addiction. They're both single-minded, zealous, highly ethnocentric, and they're shockingly violent. Both terrorists and traffickers thrive where political and judicial institutions are weak. They depend on what we call shadow facilitators, those support players that provide chemicals or weapons or money laundering services, for instance. And whether we like it or not, both the terrorists and the traffickers take our forgiving multiculturalism and our moral and cultural relativism as weakness. So you look at the blend that's currently happening today in Mexico, been happening for quite some time. In fact, the genesis of the narco-terrorism phenomenon in Mexico actually started in 1999 when the Mexican government created the GAFIS unit, the Air Mobile Special Forces Group. And that was 350 men that the finest that the Mexican military had to offer, given the best weapons, the best training, to go after the heart of the various cartels. Back in 1999, almost immediately, one of the subunits of the GAFIS, the Z unit, and Zeta is simply the letter Z in Spanish, defected en masse to go to work as the private mercenary army of the Gulf Cartel. With them, they took their training, their tactics, their weapons, and they began incorporating terroristic acts that they picked up from watching videos posted by Al-Qaeda and Taliban out of Pakistan and Afghanistan at the time. So they started beheading rival traffickers. That led to sort of an escalating game of quid pro quo from other cartels to where they pretty much all entered that slippery slope of what we call terrorist tactics. And all of the cartels, just like the terrorists, actually practice terrorist and ruthless kinds of tactics to achieve two goals. First, quite obviously, is to cow and crush any opposition, be it the public, the government, or rival traffickers. Secondly, maybe even more importantly, it tends to intensify and invigorate faith among their members. We've actually had just a a handful of Mexican sicarios or hitmen who have been arrested and ended up cooperating with U.S. authorities talk about how absolutely exhilarating it is to kill on behalf of your organization, your team, to cut somebody's heart out, to skin somebody alive. And I would remind folks that terrorism is not a specific entity or a particular ideology. It's a tactic. And it's a tactic being employed every single day so the Mexican cartels can move more dope and commit more organized crime. Now, the Zetas, for the most part, are kind of a shell of what they used to be, but those same tactics are still in use by all of the Mexican cartels across the country. And increasingly, the violence associated between those groups are not just about controlling corridors or plazas into the U.S., into North America. Increasingly, there are manifestations of frictions that happen between rival trafficking groups in places like Western Europe, in places like Asia for the acquisition of precursor chemicals, Africa, for instance, where they're bouncing loads of cocaine into West Africa, into Western Europe. And not to mention the fact that we also have increasing amounts of drug distribution and use inside Mexico. A lot of people don't realize that methamphetamine use in Mexico has quintupled in the last decade, driving much of the violence in that country. So this is not just, once again, a first world problem. It's affecting everybody. The Mexican cartels, especially as they transition from some of their traditional drugs into methamphetamine and certainly fentanyl today, they're not going to give up these profits quite easily. Fentanyl is here to stay. There is simply no better low volume, high value product, as well as being highly addictive, than fentanyl. Now, you talk about international cooperation among criminal organizations. Absolutely. The Mexicans have cooperated with gangs and local organized crime in other parts of the world in order to make both of them stronger. In Ecuador, for instance, the national gang there are the Choneros, and there are certain numbers of other smaller gangs that have allied with the Jalisco cartel, as the Choneros are allied with the Sinaloa to be able to move dope into Mexico, mainly cocaine. So those frictions have caused such a national emergency that the president of Ecuador himself has declared such a state of emergency. In Asia, for instance, and we're really talking about, on the international scene, the two big kids on a block, which are the Sinaloa and the new generation Jalisco cartel, the CJNG. And these frictions occur throughout the world. In Asia, both groups have allied with the Chinese triads, namely the Sunyi-On and the 14K triads, for the acquisition of precursor chemicals. In fact, it was Chapo Guzman who had the vision of first establishing relations with the Chinese triads, not just to move cocaine into the incredibly profitable Asian markets, but to acquire chemicals for methamphetamine and fentanyl. The Wall Street Journal actually did a recent article talking about how you can take about $800 in precursor chemicals, namely the fentanyl precursor of NPP, and turn that into about $800,000 in profit by converting it to pills on the retail market.
Wow.
That's a profit potential of 1,000 times the original investment. So this is profitable not just for the Mexican cartels, but also for the Chinese triads. The relationships with so many of the dictators and warlords and organized crime figures in West Africa is also increasing tremendously. It's a little known fact that the highest per capita crack cocaine addiction rate in the world right now is in the tiny West African nation of Guinea-Bissau, where their corrupt leaders have taken more payment from the various cartels to move cocaine through West Africa into Western Europe, taking payment in product versus money, where they in turn sell cocaine to their own citizens. It's truly, in my opinion, evil when you chemically enslave your own people with a drug that they never knew a generation ago.
So when
So I was just going to say, and certainly through Central America, the cocaine trafficking routes has done a tremendous amount of damage relative to the frictions and the gang warfare and the violence associated with what's been called sort of a bipolar world now with the two cartels in Central America. So we talked earlier about globalization being the key. Globalization will continue, and not just in terms of Mexican cartels cooperating with foreign governments, foreign organized crime, even terrorist organizations throughout the world, but we're also seeing sort of a globalized model being implemented at the very localized level. And in that, I'm talking about people like George Soros trying to undermine society by funding far left district attorneys and other local politicians that don't serve the interests of justice. They serve the interests of criminals and of chaos. George Soros has funded over the course of the last 10 years or so with about $40 million leading to the election of 75 different district attorneys across the United States, our big cities that roughly represent about 1/5 of our total population in the U.S. So you talk about undermining law enforcement. The cops can't do anything unless they get their arrestees prosecuted, incarcerated, and taken off the streets. We're increasingly hesitant to do that because I guess we find it repugnant to actually be mean to people, even people that are looking to prey upon our fellow citizens.
Yeah. Well, you're not wrong. I've had a lot of people on to talk about bail reform and just the revolving door that is the justice system is a massive, massive issue right now. That kind of brings us on to like, what are some of the areas to address, some of the solutions? And I did want to kind of ask, like, is maybe one of the solutions to look at these groups as terrorist organizations, or can they be treated as terrorist organizations?
I think they can, and I'll talk about it in point number 4. But I believe there are 4 broad areas that we need to engage in, not just as nations, but as cultures and societies, to address the drug threat, to address the fact that we've got 300 of my fellow citizens dying every single day from illegal drugs. The first is to re-educate. I personally believe that the public needs to understand, needs to know what the police knows, and that is that drugs don't simply destroy individual lives and degrade individual people, but destroys and degrades entire communities and peoples. That we're not engaged in the mass incarceration of our fellow citizens, that our prisons are not filled with mere drug users, that marijuana is in fact a gateway drug, and in fact even more than that, according to many studies with today's THC purity levels that is consumed today, actually a kind of catalyst that drives future addiction into other more toxic drugs. Most people today have no clue how dangerous the world has become, how many people and organizations are trying to prey upon and destroy our societies and our citizens. And we need to make the public understand that we're not just fighting drug cartels. We're fighting some of the world's most powerful narco-terrorists who actually happen to be based in Mexico, having their largest foreign tentacles outside of their own country in our countries to prey upon our citizens.
If I could kind of interject there too, just because that's a really good point. I've said this a few times on a few other shows where even the informants we deal with and some of the other bad guys that we just come across, they have explicitly told us, you used to spend 90% of your budget on fighting crime and 10% on whatever else, recruiting and retention and different things. You now probably spend 50% of your budget on fighting crime and 50% on these social justice initiatives, just all these kind of outlandish, like buying into all these special interest groups and what they're saying. So you're 100% right. The public needs to be educated on a lot of the things. They need to see the reality of what's actually out there, and how there are wolves among the sheep here.
That's exactly right. And like we talked about earlier, there's only one entity in society that can go out and target through the use of law the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
Churches and other social organizations and NGOs cannot do that. It's government through the police.
Yeah.
The second thing that I think needs to be done, we already talked about that, is to reinstitute stigma. Stigma is actually one of the most powerful tools that society, absent government, but society itself has to police itself. Number three, we need to relocate. And what I'm talking about there is personal responsibility. The drug epidemic in our country is not caused by poverty or racism or social dysphoria or any other supposed root cause. It's caused by individuals not taking control of their own lives, leading to healthy, lawful behaviors. Quite simply, individual character and lawful behavior matter. They matter for self, and cumulatively, they matter for society. If not, then according to Edwin Delattre, the country's resources will be exhausted in efforts to save the citizens from themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Lastly, recommit. Law enforcement does not have the resources remotely proportionate to this threat. We need to commit additional resources to law enforcement at every level: local, provincial, federal, and yes, absolutely at the Mexican border, where we know that the threat emanates from. We know, as we talked about, that drug trafficking is not a nonviolent crime. With 300 Americans dying every single day, it has rightfully been called the most murderous criminal activity in the history of the world. We know after 50 years of experience, since Nixon declared his war on drugs, that drug treatment and prevention are necessary, but that they're only strategically effective when we simultaneously reduce drug availability on the streets of America or Canada. We also need a whole of government approach. We proved that law enforcement works. We proved it in the 1960s against LSD, the 70s against heroin, 80s cocaine, 90s crack, and certainly meth labs in the 2000s. All of those reductions were not complete, but they were greatly achieved with the fair yet vigorous application of the rule of law. We also need a whole of government approach. Every cabinet level agency in our government, yours too, I believe, needs to be engaged in this struggle. This is not just a law enforcement issue. Just like our government is currently doing with the green agenda. Now, global warming may be an important topic, but it's not currently killing 110,000 Americans every single year.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the early 1980s, when cocaine first started pouring out of Colombia into North America, President Ronald Reagan picked up the phone and he called his Colombian counterpart and said, "You guys either need to start doing something yourselves in Colombia to stem the production and the export of cocaine, or you might as well stop sending us any of your coffee and cut flowers and oil." And Colombia stepped up and became one of our greatest allies, still to this day, in the Western Hemisphere. We need to do that today with Mexico, and maybe even more importantly, with China, relative to precursor chemicals moving to Mexico. And lastly, to the point you just brought up earlier, we need to declare every single one of the Mexican drug cartels today as a foreign terrorist organization pursuant to Title 8, U.S. Code Section 219, to bring new tools to bear, new resources to bear, and clearly what is an existential threat.
Mm-hmm.
We used to do all of these things: re-educate, re-stigmatize, relocate, and recommit. We need to re-engage with all of them.
I think you bring up a lot of good points. There's a lot of those values, the morals are kind of lost on society right now. And some of the stuff about personal accountability, making good choices, but also taking responsibility for your actions. You just don't see that as much nowadays. And I think we need to kind of recommit to instilling those in people. So I do want to give you a moment here to say how people can follow your work and your book.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I don't have a website up. I'm currently trying to design one as I'm getting more involved in the speaking circuit with mainly law enforcement audiences throughout the country. But my book, On Dope, can be found on Amazon.com or your favorite bookstore, hopefully. I'm also on LinkedIn. I occasionally try to write opinion pieces in some mainstream opinion news sites like American Thinker and The Intellectual Conservative. So occasionally you can read some of my work there. It's available online, some of my older pieces. But if I can just finish with one point, and that is that, you know what, this is our society and one worth fighting for, and fight we must, not just with caring and compassionate programs, but also with an aggressive and wide-ranging drug law enforcement response that upholds the rule of law and what is right against a constant onslaught of predators who only look to get rich off the backs of addiction. To not target, arrest, and imprison those who prey upon our fellow citizens, sometimes with unimaginable violence and barbarity, would not just be cowardly, it would be immoral.
Well, I think that's no better said. And I think it's a good place we could wrap up there. And I will put the links up to your book and your LinkedIn when I get the episode up. But I want to say thanks for coming on, giving us the time. Amazing stuff there that you've kind of covered throughout your whole career. So if you could hang on the line for a second, I'll say bye offline, but I wanted to thank you just before we go.
Well, thank you, Nathan, for what you do, and certainly to the tremendous support and partnership that DEA has had over the years with our Canadian counterparts. So thank you.
Great.